The morning light streamed through the Taylor household like any other day, wrapping the small home in a warm, deceptive calm. Laura Taylor, a single mother juggling 2 jobs and constant exhaustion, opened the door to a man in a crisp gray suit holding an official-looking badge. Greg Dalton, Child Welfare Services. He introduced himself with a reassuring smile. There's been a routine order for evaluation. We just need to speak with Ben for a short while. Standard protocol. Something in Laura's gut hesitated, but the badge looked real, and he knew Ben's full name. Her defenses, worn thin by fatigue and stress, wavered. "It won't take long, right?" she asked, brushing her son's curls out of his eyes. Ben, barely 9, clutched his backpack nervously. Greg gave her a kind smile, the kind that had been practiced in mirrors. "Of course not. He'll be back by lunch." By the time Laura realized something was wrong when Ben's phone went straight to voicemail. When her messages went unread, it was already too late. Panic set in. Her frantic calls led to a horrifying realization. No one from Child Welfare Services had scheduled a home visit. Across town, Detective Mike Reynolds, a veteran K-9 officer with a sharp mind and sharper instincts, received the emergency call. His eyes narrowed when he heard the details. Something about the case, it wasn't just another missing child. It had a wrongness to it, a deliberate cruelty. He didn't hesitate. "I'm taking Ranger," Mike said. The room went quiet. Ranger, a once legendary German Shepherd K-9, hadn't been deployed in nearly a year. After losing his handler in an ambush during a raid, Ranger had spiraled into trauma and had only recently started retraining. The brass was skeptical, but Mike was insistent. That dog was born for this. He just needs one reason to believe again. Later that afternoon, standing at the threshold of the Taylor home, Ranger stiffened. His ears perked up. The scent was faint but undeniable. Ben had been here. With a short, sharp bark, Ranger began to move toward the forest, toward the unknown. The forest swallowed sound. Branches overhead knotted together, turning the sunlight into a muted green haze as Mike and Ranger pushed deeper into the trail. Ranger paused at a fork in the path, nose twitching, muscles tense. Then, a low growl rumbled in his throat. Mike crouched beside him. "You've got something." Ranger barked once, clipped and focused, then veered sharply left. The trail was rough now, no obvious path, just wild undergrowth. It wasn't random. Ranger was following something. About a mile in, they found the first clue, a small red jacket tangled in a briar patch. It was torn slightly at the sleeve and unmistakably Ben's. Mike picked it up carefully, then glanced at Ranger. "Good boy. Keep going." Meanwhile, deep in the woods, Greg Dalton stirred the campfire, his eyes flicking toward the small figure curled inside a makeshift tent. Ben sat with arms around his knees, eyes wide and untrusting. He hadn't spoken in hours. Greg leaned forward, voice syrupy. "Your mom, she didn't want you anymore. That's why I came. I'm the only one who gives a damn." Ben turned away, trembling. He didn't believe the man, but fear was starting to unravel his certainty. Back on the trail, Ranger hesitated, his breath quickening. The wind carried a sound low, rhythmic. Mike heard it too. A creak, running water. Then, suddenly, Ranger froze. He dropped into a crouch, ears pinned back, and emitted a sound Mike hadn't heard from him since before the ambush, a focused, ready snarl. Mike followed his gaze and spotted it. A boot print in the soft earth. Large, fresh. They were close. But with every step forward, Ranger's body language changed, not out of fear, but memory. This terrain, the way the air moved, it was triggering flashbacks. Mike saw it in the dog's posture, tension, hesitation, haunted eyes. "You're okay," Mike whispered, placing a steady hand on Ranger's neck. "We do this together." Ranger steadied, then surged ahead toward Ben. Greg Dalton had grown restless. Something in the air had shifted. The birds had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He stuffed supplies into a duffel, grabbed Ben by the arm, and yanked him to his feet. "We're leaving," he muttered. Ben struggled, fear flashing in his eyes. "I want to go home." Greg leaned down, his voice cold. "This is your home now." But before he could take a step, a sharp bark cracked through the trees. Greg spun, scanning the underbrush. His grip on Ben tightened. Then Ranger burst from the foliage, a blur of muscle and fury, snarling with precision and power. He skidded to a halt between Greg and Ben, baring his teeth. Mike Reynolds appeared moments later, weapon drawn. "Step away from the boy." Greg panicked. He pulled a small folding knife from his belt and pressed it against Ben's neck, eyes wild. "Don't come closer." Mike didn't flinch. "Put it down. You're not walking out of here with him." Greg's hand trembled, but he backed up a step, dragging Ben with him. Ranger didn't wait for a command. He had been trained for this. He lunged. In a flash, the knife flew from Greg's hand, clattering to the ground. Greg fell hard, pinned under 80 pounds of trained force. Ranger growled low, teeth inches from the man's throat, but he didn't bite. He held. Mike rushed forward, cuffing Greg while Ranger remained on high alert. "You're done," Mike said coldly. "Hurting stops now." Ben, wide-eyed and shaking, stood frozen. Then Ranger turned, walked up slowly, and sat. He didn't growl. He didn't retreat. He simply looked at Ben and wagged his tail. Ben stepped forward hesitantly, then reached out with a trembling hand and touched Ranger's head. The dog leaned into the touch. For the first time in days, Ben smiled. The forest was no longer a place of fear. As the officers secured Greg Dalton in the back of a patrol unit, Ben sat quietly on the tailgate of Mike's truck, wrapped in a thermal blanket. His hands were still shaking, but his eyes never left Ranger, who sat beside him like a guardian angel in fur. Mike crouched down. "You okay, buddy?" Ben nodded faintly. "Ranger saved me." Mike gave the dog a long look. "Yeah, he did." As they drove back to town, Ben fell asleep in the back seat, his head resting against Ranger's shoulder. The retired K9 didn't move a muscle, as if he knew that any shift might wake the boy from the first safe sleep he'd had in days. When they reached the station, Laura Taylor was already there, eyes red, arms trembling. The moment Ben stepped through the door, she rushed forward. "Ben, Mom." The embrace was fierce, unfiltered, and full of every emotion words could never contain. Laura dropped to her knees and held him as if she'd never let go again. Ranger stood beside them, watchful. Mike approached, speaking softly. He was brave. They both were. Laura looked up, her eyes misty. "Thank you, both of you." Ben turned to Ranger. "Can he come visit us?" Mike smiled. "We'll see what we can do." That night, Mike sat outside the station under the stars, Ranger at his feet. The dog rested his chin on Mike's boot. "You did good today," Mike said, rubbing Ranger's head. "Real good." Ranger looked up, his eyes calmer than they had been in years. He had gone into the woods carrying the weight of trauma but come out carrying a boy to safety. He'd found his purpose again. Weeks passed. Greg Dalton faced federal charges for kidnapping and impersonating a government official. His case made headlines, but in the small town where it had unfolded, people were more focused on something else, something quiet, powerful, and deeply human. Ranger. Word spread of the retired K9's heroism, and though he didn't understand the news stories or the praise, he could feel the shift. People no longer looked at him with pity, they looked with respect. At home, Mike noticed the change too. Ranger no longer flinched at loud noises. His sleep was deeper, more peaceful. He wagged his tail when kids walked by instead of withdrawing into himself. He had come back to life. One Sunday afternoon, Mike and Ranger visited the Taylors' home. Laura greeted them at the door, holding a plate of homemade cookies and wearing a smile that said thank you 100 different ways. In the backyard, Ben played with a tennis ball, tossing it across the grass. Ranger fetched it gently, happily, and dropped it at Ben's feet, tail wagging. Ben looked up at Mike. "He's not just a hero. He's my friend." Mike nodded. "Yeah, he is." As the sun dipped low behind the trees, Ranger rested in the grass, his head in Ben's lap. The boy stroked his ears, whispering something only Ranger could hear. The moment was quiet, but it was everything. From brokenness, healing. From fear, trust. From one child's nightmare, a dog's redemption. And in the end, neither Ranger nor Ben had saved the other alone. They had saved each other.